Hello, this is Tim Congdon. I'm giving the usual monthly update on economic developments around the world. I want this time, as so much in the recent past, to focus on the United States, but I think the analysis I want to give has got a wider message. There's a story in the Financial Times on the 17th of March saying that the American recovery from COVID-19 would be stronger than in the European Union. And it said that this would be due to more expansionary American fiscal policy. And what I want to do today is to examine this proposition and to cast some skeptical comments on the role of fiscal policy in the business cycle. There's no dispute that the American budget deficit is at phenomenal levels. I'm using the figures from the Congressional Budget Office. The deficit last year was 15% of GDP, and this year is expected to be 10% of GDP, with much of this figure due to President Biden's so-called rescue package. The discussion and analysis of this package is very much what I want to focus on today. Both of these figures are 15%, it's the highest since the Second World War, and the 10%, the second highest. So there's no doubt that fiscal policy is, at the moment, in quite extraordinary numbers. What many economists, following the Keynesian textbooks, believe is that when the budget deficit is increased, this injects spending and demand into the economy and boosts economic activity. So it's more likely that there's going to be above-trend growth of demand and output. And indeed, the Keynesians often say that it's fiscal policy is the dominant influence on economic activity in the business cycle, and they often are very rude about monetary policy and say that it's less effective or not effective at all. Okay, that's what they say, and that's what lies behind that FT story on the 17th of March and much other commentary at the moment. Let's just check the facts. Let's just go back over the last 40 years of data. I'm going to do, first of all, is show you a picture of the American economy in terms of the fluctuations of output around its trend figure, again using numbers prepared by the CBO, Congressional Budget Office. And here is the chart. I think the main features are clear enough. You can see the deep recession in the very start of the 1980s because of Volcker's attempt to squeeze inflation out of the American economy. You see the big dip to beneath trend levels of output with the Great Recession, and also recessions, smaller ones, in 1990 and in 2001, just after the dot-com boom, and in association with the dot-com bust. Okay, so that's clearly a fair representation of the American business cycle. Above trend, beneath trend growth, and so on. Let's now look at fiscal policy. And here I'm using numbers from the International Monetary Fund. The IMF gives us annual data on the change in the, sorry, a bit technical, the cyclically adjusted budget deficit. Sometimes, of course, there's a surplus, but it shows when there's an increase in the deficit, that's stimulatory, according to Keynesian thinking, and when there's a reduction in the deficit because of tax increase or spending cuts, then that is a negative for the economy, that is contractionary fiscal policy. So what you've got here is the Reagan supply-side tax cuts of the 1980s. Clearly, fiscal policy is positive, above the zero line. It's then negative, in a fairly big way, under President Clinton in the 1990s. The Obama presidency, very stimulatory time of Great Recession, and then very contractionary in the second Obama term. All of that is relatively uncontroversial and fairly straightforward. So when you've got these pictures of fiscal policy and of the business cycle in the USA, so let's now put them together and see whether fiscal policy works. Is there a relationship between these two lines? Look at it. There isn't one. Let's then look at some more specific episodes so that we can try and work out, let me try and reinforce the conclusion I've just drawn. You've got all these economists saying that fiscal policy is crucial to the economy. You get the stories in the FT and elsewhere about all this stuff. And then you just check the evidence. There isn't a relationship of this sort. It just isn't true. Sometimes it's fair enough. Yes, there is expansion of fiscal policy and there's above trend growth every now and again, but not all the time and not systematically. We can see particularly clearly in the Clinton presidency. I said that year after year we had reductions in defense spending, moves towards budget surplus, and that was contractionary fiscal policy year after year. And you can see year after year above trend growth in the economy. You look at the blue line, the output line, and it's always above zero. You look at the fiscal line, it's always beneath zero. Fiscal policy contractionary, that's above trend growth. You then have got the famous fiscal cliff episode in 2013. You had start of the Great Recession, some tax cuts, pushed up the budget deficit. Fears about that then meant that in that legislation there were provisions for withdrawing the tax cuts after a few years. That then meant there was going to be a tightening of fiscal policy in 2013. And you had hordes of Keynesian economists, from the Nobel laureates Paul Krugman and Joe Stiglitz downwards, saying there's going to be a recession because of this fiscal cliff. Well, just look at the numbers. You can see there was indeed the fiscal cliff where the fiscal line, the orange line, collapsed. But actually, the growth of domestic final sales was higher in 2014 than in 2013. And indeed, if you look at the whole of the Obama second term, you had the same pattern as under Clinton. Year after year, fiscal policy was contractionary, and year after year, there was trend or above trend growth. Keynesianism, fiscalist Keynesianism just doesn't work. It just isn't true. No matter how many newspaper stories you see about it, it's just one big lie. Now, why is that? Because it seems rather logical, surely, that the government spends more, then that means that there's going to be more demand, more output, doesn't it? Or if there's tax cuts, then that must mean people have got more money in their bank accounts and in their wallets and purses, and surely that also means more spending and demand, doesn't it? Well, it doesn't. And let me now just give some reasons why this rather basic idea in economics just doesn't work. One possibility is that the extra deficit's got to be financed. If it's financed by issuing bonds, that may push interest rates up, and that discourages private spending. So-called crowding out, an argument often used by Milton Friedman. There's also a proposition associated with the Harvard economist Robert Barrow that, we're all very clever, and we know that when the government issues more debt, then in future years there's got to be an increase in taxes to pay the interest on that debt, so that actually maybe an increase in government spending, we don't feel any better off, so there's no effect on our spending. I'd like to make a further comment here, and it actually, again, I want to refer to something in the Financial Times. This is on the 15th of March, in fact, and it was a direct reference to the Biden rescue package and the so-called stimulus checks that are being paid actually just this moment, like last week or so, and in a few weeks to come. These stimulus checks are going to be paid to American households. They'll be of the order of a few £1,000s, depending on how many children they have, and a few $1,000s, depending on how many children they have. Many households in the United States have not had any great problems because of COVID-19. Of course, it's different if you've been in the hotel or travel industries or aerospace or whatever, but many households' life just carried on as normal, except that economically at least. And so they will use their checks, their stimulus checks, not to spend more on the shops or on the websites, but to put it into the stock market. This is quite an important point. I'm not sure it's been explained elsewhere very clearly, and I want to just take a bit of time over this. Suppose that you were given a spending voucher by the government, and you use that to buy a second-hand car. The car's already been made. You spend it on something that already exists. It doesn't stimulate the economy. Of course, if you order a new car, then that does boost spending, and so it's important to see how spending is split between purchasing new things in what economists call income, expenditure, output, circular flow, whether it's spent on an existing asset, a financial asset, a second-hand car, antiques, whatever, when there's no stimulatory effect on the economy. Look, if stimulus checks are used to buy stocks, there's no effect in that first round on the income, expenditure, output, circular flow. If the stimulus were entirely through one-off spending vouchers, there'd be no effect in boosting demand at all. Now, in practice, the really important thing here is how the deficit is financed. If the deficit is financed by borrowing from the banks, that creates new money, new bank deposits, and bank deposits are not one-off spending vouchers, they're permanent spending vouchers. They can go round and round and round from one bank account, another bank account, another bank account, and so on. And so the increase in the quantity of money boosts the equilibrium values of income, wealth, or stocks and shares, wealth, and also transactions. And that's why it's so important to follow what's happening to the financing pattern of the deficit rather than the total amount of the deficit. You can have a large budget deficit, and if it's all financed by bond sales with no effect on the quantity of money, it doesn't stimulate the economy. Or conversely, you can have contractory fiscal policy, and it doesn't cause any negative effect on demand. It's the quantity of money that's really crucial here, not fiscal policy by itself. Well, we know that in the next few months in the United States, it's likely that the bulk of the financing of the deficit will in fact take monetary form. We know that because there's been another announcement in recent weeks that something called the Treasury General Account, this is a deposit the government itself has at the Federal Reserve, is to be reduced from over $1.5 trillion at the end of last year to about $500 billion at the end of June. And this means that money will be spent by the government boosting bank deposits held by the private sector, which will cause money growth. In fact, on the face of it, if it is indeed $1 trillion, $1,000 billion, that's about 4% addition to the quantity of money by itself. So I would expect that we'll see in 2021 not only this vast budget deficit, but also rather high monetary growth, perhaps not as high as last year, but certainly numbers of the order, say, 1% a month. Obviously, we'll track them as we're going through 2021. And this is a crucial reason why we should be expecting in 2021 further buoyancy in asset prices, at least for the next few months, I suggest. People started to get worried about inflation, but quite a bit depends on whether banks start to lend to the private sector again, and this is something that does need to be watched as well. One has also to notice that American policymakers in general are paying no attention at all to these monetary trends, and they also think that any increase in inflation will be temporary. I don't, but we'll just watch this space. So to conclude, there is going to be a stronger recovery in the USA than in Europe in 2021, probably in 2022 as well. But I think that it's a result of really two things above all. First of all, that the rollout of the vaccine program has been quicker and more effective in the United States. And the second point is that it's not just a matter of fiscal policy, it's crucially that there's been rapid monetary growth in the USA since spring of last year. And that lies behind not just the buoyancy of demand and strength of commodity prices, also behind the very strong stock market that we've had since last March. So it's not just a matter of looking at the fiscal deficit, as the Keynesians claim. No, monetary trends are very important, and in fact they're really much more important ultimately to what's happened to inflation than the budgetary position. Thank you.